If you're a Canadian who has lived or worked in the United States, where you retire could change your lifetime taxes by hundreds of thousands of dollars. However, it's not just about taxes. Healthcare, government benefits, OAS clawbacks, estate taxes, and even currency risk all play a factor. Today, I'm breaking down the real financial comparison between retiring in the United States versus Canada. My name is Brian Haggard. I'm a certified financial planner, chartered financial analyst, and I'm the founder of Retirement Financial. We specialize in helping cross border families simplify the retirement between the US and Canada. And a lot of our clients, when they come to us, they don't have a huge preference in where they retire. Maybe they are really want to go back up to Canada where their family's from. Maybe they have family down here in the US, but they don't have a huge preference. And they just want to look at what country is better for them to retire in. Today, we're going to break down some of the big financial considerations that we go through with our clients. Now, this video is for Canadians who have worked here in the United States. Maybe they're dual citizens. Maybe you're a US green card holder. Maybe you're even a visa holder considering staying here down in the States. This will apply to any of you. Now, one of the biggest differences between retiring in the US versus retiring in Canada are income taxes. You've probably all heard that retiring in Canada means my taxes are going to go sky high. But what does that actually mean? In a recent video, we ran a comparison of US versus Canadian taxes. And we looked at somebody who was retiring in North Carolina here in the US versus somebody in Ontario in Canada. And the reason we did that is both North Carolina and Ontario are kind of middle of the road tax areas. North Carolina has state taxes. There's some states that don't tax anything. There's other states that tax much more on income. And Ontario is kind of middle of the road as well. You might have Alberta taxes, which are lower, or you might be moving to Nova Scotia or another state or province that is going to be much higher. And we looked at three different comparisons. We looked at somebody with $60,000 of US income, 120,000 of US income, and 180,000 of US income. And we looked at what it means for both countries. In breaking it down with somebody who has 60,000 of US dollar income, and all of that income came from Social Security, CPP, and OAS benefits, you can see there's a significant difference between retiring in the US versus Canada. Here in the US, if you were married and you earned $60,000, all of it came from Social Security type benefits, you would pay zero in both federal and most state taxes. Comparing that to Canada, where you would end up paying a little over $6,000 on that same amount of income. And those Canada taxes are US dollars. Everything on this chart is translated back to US dollars at a 1.35 exchange rate. Now, let's compare. It's kind of a same situation where a couple has received $60,000 in Social Security, CPP, and OAS benefits, but now they took an additional $60,000 out from their retirement accounts. Those retirement accounts might be US retirement accounts or Canadian retirement accounts. It doesn't matter that much. And you can see the tax difference is still relatively large. Here in the US, you'd pay about $8,000 in taxes. In Canada, in US dollars, you'd end up paying about $12,700 in taxes for a difference of a little over $5,000. But what's interesting to me is as you earn more income, the tax differential actually contracts a little bit. You actually pay more on a relative basis on lower income, especially if that income's from Social Security benefits here in the U.S. versus middle of the ground income, somebody who makes 120,000 of U.S. dollars. Now let's look at what happens if that same family withdrew $120,000 from their retirement accounts. Now they have 180,000 US dollars in retirement income. And now you can see the big differences between retiring in the US versus Canada. In that situation, in the US, you'd pay a little over $21,000 in Canada in taxes. And in Canada, you'd be paying over $40,000 in taxes, nearly a $20,000 difference in taxes once your income starts to exceed those higher thresholds. And this is what we find that usually if your income exceeds about 110, 120,000 Canadian dollars, your taxes really start to spike. You can get into a 50% marginal tax bracket pretty quickly. And so for those higher income earners, you can see a big difference between retiring in the US versus retiring in Canada. Another big difference between retiring in the US versus retiring in Canada are government benefits and what benefits you may qualify for. Now, the benefits that you qualify for, if you qualify for Social Security, it doesn't matter if you retire in the US or Canada. You'll still be eligible for your full Social Security benefit. And if you're married, there's a really good chance that your spouse will also get a benefit. That really doesn't matter if you retire in the US or Canada. CPP or Canada Pension Plan is the same thing. You can retire in the US or Canada and you're still going to qualify for the same amount no matter which country that you retire at. The differences start to kick in at OAS or your old age security benefit. OAS can be a pretty substantial benefit for a lot of families that have lived in Canada. However, retiring in Canada might not be so friendly for your OAS benefit. In Canada, if you retire and you earn over certain thresholds of income, it's about 90 or 95,000 Canadian, your OAS benefit starts to get reduced. And if you earn over about 125,000 Canadian, your OAS benefit gets completely eliminated. That is not the case if you retire here in the United States. You can earn as much as possible and you're still going to collect an OAS benefit from Canada. It's a little odd, but that is the case. And these numbers can start to add up for you. For example, if you've lived in Canada for 20 years after the age of 18, you're going to be eligible for roughly $370 per month in OAS benefits. If you're married, that's benefits of about $750 per month Canadian coming to you. Well, you can imagine if your income is higher and you end up retiring in Canada, that $750 could be reduced or even eliminated because of the OAS income clawback. And that's a huge negative of retiring in Canada, especially if you're a higher income earner. And even $90,000, $95,000 where OAS starts to get eliminated can come pretty quick when you might have $50,000, $60,000 a year in government benefits like Social Security, CPP, and other retirement withdrawals. And that's Canadian dollars. So we have a lot of clients when they move back to Canada get a reduced or eliminated OAS benefit. Now, there is one benefit of retiring in Canada that you would not get here in the United States, and that is GIS or the Guaranteed Income Supplement. If you're a lower income earner in Canada, you may qualify for this additional benefit if you retire in Canada. That is a benefit that would not be available for you if you retire in the United States. Let's talk about another one of those big differences between retiring in the US versus Canada, and that's healthcare costs. As we all know, if you retire in Canada, your healthcare costs are going to be much, much less than what they would be if you retire in the US. If you retire in Canada and you have provincial health insurance available to you, there's a good chance that you are going to pay nothing or very little in health insurance by retiring up in Canada. We have clients that sometimes will purchase a supplemental plan once they're up in Canada. That might cost them $1,000 or so a year, but it's nothing compared to what they're probably going to pay down here in the US. If you're 65 or older here in the US and you've worked in the US for at least 10 years, there's a good chance that you're going to qualify for Medicare. And Medicare is a really good health benefit for a lot of people, but it can be costly. We typically find that somebody who is on a good Medicare plan here in the United States is probably going to be paying somewhere between $5,000 to $6,000 per year for health insurance costs down here in the United States. And that doesn't cover dental and other expenses that they may have. And so if you're a family and you have a couple of people, you can easily see that your health insurance costs down here in the United States could exceed $10,000, $12,000 per year. And that's much larger than any, for a lot of people, larger than the tax savings they're going to get by retiring here in the United States versus Canada, unless you're one of those higher income earners that we talked about earlier. Now, what health insurance is better? That's debatable. We've had clients move back up to Canada, and they've had a lot of issues finding doctors, finding physicians that are assigned to them, and it can take much longer to get any operations or procedures they need done. So some people will say, well, it's worth it to pay them more money to be here in the United States to get a little bit better coverage. Other people would prefer to go up to Canada, know that maybe things aren't going to be as quick up there, but they don't need to pay for any of that out of pocket. It's not going to bankrupt them. Another large difference between retiring in the US and retiring in Canada is what happens with when you die. What happens with that estate tax upon passing away? And this is a significant difference. So here in the United States, we do have an estate tax. However, that estate tax doesn't really kick in until you have over about $15 million as an individual or about $30 million as a couple. And just a lot of people, because those exemptions or numbers are so high, don't have an estate tax when they pass away. Besides that estate tax, if you're under those numbers, the estate tax here in the United States is pretty friendly. Your heirs get a step up in cost basis, meaning that, if you have stocks, they don't have to pay anything, or you don't have to pay anything once they sell those and distribute those stocks or any other capital gains that they may have. If you have registered accounts like IRA accounts, that money can go on to your heirs completely tax free, and they have 10 years to withdraw that money. They'd pay taxes at that time, but they can do it in a more spread out way. This is a pretty easy way. A lot of times people face very little or no taxes upon passing away here in the States. That is a difference between Canada. In Canada, we find sometimes families can have pretty significant tax burdens upon passing away. And that's because in Canada, there is no step up in cost basis. If you own stocks or maybe you own a family cottage and you to pass away and you have a large unrealized cost basis, that money has grown a lot since you've owned it. Your heirs can be on the hook for a pretty big tax burden at that point. The other issue would be if you have RSPs or even IRAs when you pass away as a Canadian resident, that is all deemed to be distributed when you pass away. If you have $1 million or $2 million in pre-tax IRAs or RSPs and you were to die and all of that gets included on your Canadian tax return on the year of your death, that could be a substantial tax hit to you. So, although Canada does not have an estate tax like we do have here in the United States, we do find that the state taxes overall are much lower here in the States than they are in Canada. One last thing that you may want to consider when you're looking at retiring in the US versus Canada is your currency situation and your lifestyle, your cost of living situation as well. For example, if a lot of your assets and a lot of your income are Canadian based, trying to bring that down to the US right now, where you're only getting 70, 72 cents on the dollar, can feel like quite a hit when you're trying to bring that money down. Now, look at it the other way. If you have a lot of US based assets and you're retiring up in Canada, going up and getting a 35 or 40% bump to those currencies because you're now converting that to Canadian dollars can be a big deal for a lot of people. Now, the cost of living up in the Canada tends to be quite a bit higher than it is here in the United States. Homes are more expensive, cost of goods are more expensive. Typically, sales taxes are going to be more expensive up in Canada. However, If you have a lot of US dollar assets and getting a 25, 35, 40% boost to those assets because of the Canadian dollar weakness, that can make up a lot of difference in that cost of living. And again, trying to move your Canadian assets down to the US and taking a 30% haircut can also mean a lot to you as well. At the end of the day, financials are really, really important to look at when considering what countries to ultimately retire in. But for a lot of people, it's a much bigger decision to that. Where's the family at? Where do I feel more comfortable at? For a lot of people nowadays, it might be politics and where do they feel more welcome at as well? It all goes into play of where you may want to end up retiring. As I mentioned before, a lot of clients come to us and they just say, Brian, where's the best place financially for me to retire? And let's look at some of the things that we've talked about today. Certainly income tax wise, you're going to pay less. Almost everybody's going to pay significantly less here in the United States than they would in Canada. However, for a lot of people, the healthcare costs that they're paying in the US, especially if you're retiring prior to age 65, could be substantially more here in the United States. We have people that, although their taxes might be $6,000, $7,000 less, they might be paying $20,000 more in medical costs here in the United States and in Canada, and that might wipe out all of the other tax or all the other financial benefits of retiring here in the United States. So we talked about retirement benefits, the government benefits that you get, typically a little bit more friendly here in the United States because you're going to always get your full OAS benefit, where in Canada, that OAS benefit could be reduced or even eliminated if your income is too high. Estate taxes here in the US tend to be just a little bit more friendly. Typically, your heirs or yourself will pay less in taxes upon your passing as opposed to in the United States, as opposed to Canada. So those are some of the big financial decisions that you have to make and what might be better. We've run this scenario for tens, if not hundreds of different clients before. In financially, it tends to make it look better to retire in the United States versus Canada. However, again, does that make it better for you to retire in the US? Not necessarily, but financially, a lot of people tend to be a little bit better here in the US than Canada because of the things that we've talked about. If you've lived or worked in both the US and Canada, your retirement decision isn't simple. We built a cross-border retirement calculator that estimates your Canada pension plan, your old age security and social security benefits to get you real numbers about what your retirement may look like. You can click on the link below, both in the description and in the comment, to find out what your numbers are going to be like. If you're interested in speaking with a cross-border consultant in a free consultation, you could schedule a meeting at the link below or at retiremitten.com. Thank you so much for listening today. We look forward to speaking with you soon.